Hey guys, what's up? This is going to be my second glossary video where I just run through a bunch of linguistics terms, define them, and maybe provide some examples, and it's for people who are trying to get into linguistics but just can't figure out the jargon. But of course, there'll be interesting stuff for my routine viewers as well. I've already made a glossary video about nouns and pronouns, and some of what was discussed back then will come up again, so it may be worth it to give yourself a refresher. But today, we're talking about verbs. Let's go! So to start, what's a verb? You're probably familiar with the term from Mad Libs, but basically, verbs are the part of speech, or word class, that tell you the action of the subject. Subject is a term I went over in the noun video. It's what the subject is doing, do being a very common example of a verb. Most of the verbs you'll see are what's known as action verbs, which is exactly what it sounds like, verbs that actually describe actions like run, jump, swim, see, describe, stop, etc. However, there are two other types of verbs you should know about. First, there's the verb be with all its forms, and it's known as a copula. It just equates nouns to each other or to adjectives and is basically always the most common verb in a language. And there are also some verbs that don't indicate an action but are instead paired with an action verb to show like a tense, or maybe they need to be there for some other grammatical reason, and these are called auxiliary verbs, often shortened to just aux verbs. For example, in the English sentence, I will see it, will is an aux verb. It doesn't tell you the action, that's see, but will tells you that the action is future tense. It's important to know about copulas and aux verbs because they may have rules of their own separate from action verbs. For example, in many European languages, there's a rule where in questions, the verb moves to the beginning of the sentence. But in English, only copulas and aux verbs can do this, like with the question version of our previous sentence, will I see it? That's grammatical because will is an aux verb, but saw you it is ungrammatical in English because see is an action verb. Stuff like that can happen. Next, we'll talk about verb classes. Much like how noun classes are different categories of nouns in terms of how they change for different grammatical functions, verb classes are categories of verbs that get conjugated differently. English doesn't have them, but an example you may be familiar with is Spanish, which has three verb classes, ar, and ir, based on the infinitive suffix, and all Romance languages I know of do something along those lines. Now in Spanish, those verb classes have nothing to do with the meaning of the verb, but in many other languages, the class is connected to something on the verb called either transitivity or valency. Transitivity in linguistics basically indicates which objects a verb can take. The different objects were discussed extensively in the noun glossary, and in fact, I did define the two most basic transitivities there out of necessity. A transitive verb can take a direct object, like see, while an intransitive verb cannot, like sleep. However, as we're about to see, the tandem between transitive and intransitive is a simplification. The words we've introduced are actually a false binary. There are more of them. In more advanced linguistics jargon, while intransitive verbs still can't take a direct object, transitive verbs are actually required to take a direct object. Not giving them one would be either awkward or just wrong. Take is an example of a transitive verb under the strict definition. A verb like see would instead be called ambitransitive. It can take a direct object, but it doesn't have to. The last type of transitivity is ditransitive, which is when a verb has to take both a direct and indirect object. The most common example of these is give. But there is one rarer type of transitivity that seldom gets talked about, and it's called the quirky subject. These verbs govern two objects, one direct and one indirect, but with no subject. It's most discussed in Icelandic. For example, Byrnunum líkar við mátt. This means the bear likes power, and in it, the bear doing the liking is in the dative case, while the power, which is liked, is in a prepositional phrase in the accusative case. Nothing here is nominative. So now about valencies, which are basically more advanced forms of transitivity. There are three of them you should know. First is causative, which is where you alter a verb root to make it so that the subject is causing the object to do the verb. Hebrew, for example, has a verb class dedicated to the causative, so like lazuz means move yourself, while leaziz means move something else, or make it move because it's causative. Another important valency is reflexive, which is when the subject does the verb to itself. Hebrew also has verb classes dedicated to this, so levalbel means confuse, while litbalbel means get confused. Also, a lot of Indo-European languages use a cognate pronoun for this purpose, normally looking something like se. Our final important valency often gets lumped in with the reflexive. It's the reciprocal, which describes two subjects doing the verb to each other. In fact, that's how it's expressed in English, with each other. In most languages with reflexive grammar though, you'd use the reflexive construction, and you'd know it's reciprocal from context and the fact that the subject is plural. So finally, what do we even call this concept of a verb mandating that its objects look a certain way? That would be government, and it applies to a lot more stuff, like verbs governing adpositions and adpositions governing cases. So now basically the rest of the video is going to cover various conjugational categories, so before that, let's introduce conjugations. A conjugation is any alteration you make to a verb to indicate something. A lot of languages have a basic conjugation chart that looks something like this, with affixes that differentiate the subject. This is often done using two terms we discussed in the noun video. The columns represent number, while the rows represent grammatical person, and there may also be differences based on the gender or noun class of the subject. However, some languages like Cherokee also mandatorily indicate the object on the verb, so be aware of that. Alright, now we can really get into verb-specific jargon. Back in the noun glossary, I briefly covered the misconception that the subject is always the agent or doer of the verb. Well, this category of conjugation clears that up. I'm talking about voice. Grammatical voice is basically an indication on the verb of whether the subject is doing the verb or having the verb done to it, among other arrangements. The most basic voice is the active voice. It means that the subject is doing the verb, and it's found in the vast majority of sentences you'll ever see. Conversely, the passive voice means that the subject is having the verb done to it. Most European languages express the passive voice by putting the copula with the passive participle. A participle, by the way, is an adjective made from a verb that has some verbal feature attached to it, in this case the passive voice, hence passive participle. However, there are other ways. Biblical Hebrew and Classical Arabic both had verb conjugation specific to the passive voice. Meanwhile, Telugu adds a suffix to the verb, and Cherokee uses a different form of the prefix that indicates the subject and object. By the way, Telugu and Cherokee are the two most foreign languages I've studied, so I will rely on them for examples quite a bit, especially Cherokee since it's very verb heavy. There are some other voices though. You may hear talk about the middle voice, which is basically just when you use a transitive verb intransitively. For example, the sidewalk is baking if it's really hot. You can also combine the middle and passive voices into the media passive voice, which I see a bit more of, like in Swedish with the s suffix, like how smaka means taste something, while smakas means taste, like have a flavor. This also leads to an interesting thing called deponent verbs, verbs that are functionally active but look like they're in another voice, like Swedish lyckas, succeed. Now we'll talk about tense. Tense is an indication on the verb of when it happens in relation to right now. Functionally, there are three tenses. Present tense means it's happening now, past tense means it happened before now, and future tense means it will happen later, and you've probably heard all those terms before in some contexts. These terms can also be combined for languages that have only two tenses. You may have past and non-past, or future and non-future, both of which are fairly self-explanatory. In addition, some languages specify past and future more, giving us the recent past and distant past, along with the near future and far future. However, I should also mention that the word tense is commonly used in two different ways in linguistics. What I just gave is the narrower definition that only includes time itself. But you may also hear people talking about tense in regards to any combination of verbal attributes in a language. This is more accurately called tense aspect mood, or TAM for short, and you're about to learn exactly what those other two things are. So now we'll talk about the A in TAM, aspect. If tense is the primary indicator of when a verb happens, then aspect is how long the verb happens for, or how frequently it happens, or what part of the action you're at. It's a secondary timing measure. To start, some languages have a simple two-way distinction between imperfective and perfective. Imperfective means that the action happens over an undefined period of time, while perfective means that the action has a clear start and end, or just happened once. Most Slavic languages, for example, have one of these two aspects inherently embedded within any given verb. However, both of these aspects contain several more specific aspects within them. Within the imperfective group, there's first the progressive aspect, which indicates that the action is ongoing at whatever time you're talking about. We have this in English in the form of be doing something, and in fact, this is an aerial feature within Western Europe. By the way, the form that doing is in is called the gerund. A similar but distinct aspect found in Telugu is the durative or delimitative aspect. It has two names. This one also indicates the ongoing nature of a verb, but it comes with the additional implication that the action is only happening for a while. It'll stop at some point. So while there's a lot of overlap between the progressive and the durative, they're not exactly the same. But on the contrary, what if the action isn't actively happening, but instead there's a tendency for it? This is where you'd use the habitual aspect. Cherokee has it in the form of the suffix oi, but also AAVE has it in the form of habitual be, which is probably the most discussed feature of the dialect. Along similar lines, the interval aspect aspect is also habitual, but it's used specifically when the action happens at intervals, as the name implies. It's also a Cherokee thing, coming in various forms depending on the surroundings. A more specific variant of this may be the iterative aspect, which describes a repeating action happening over and over again. Guess what? Cherokee also has it in the form of an ilo suffix. I'm very glad I studied Cherokee before making this video. And the last of the imperfective group is the gnomic aspect, which is often just habitual, but it's used specifically for general facts like hot oil is dangerous. So now let's talk about the aspects under the perfective umbrella, starting with the opposite of gnomic, episodic. The episodic aspect refers to specific actions, not general ones. I haven't studied any languages with such a distinction, but apparently literary Swahili and ancient Greek both used it. You may also say that the ser estar distinction in Portuguese, Spanish, and Catalan is an example of this, with ser being gnomic and estar being episodic. As for other perfective varieties, one of them is the inchoative aspect, which indicates that you're starting to do something. Think of the difference between stand and stand up. Of course, we don't have this grammaticalized in English. Up is just the direction. But the best example of this in the languages I've studied is the Hungarian prefix meg in certain contexts. For example, al in Hungarian means stand, but megal means stop, like assume a standing rather than walking status. Pretty cool. The opposite of the inchoative is the terminative aspect, which refers to an action ending, and it's something that, you guessed it, Cherokee has with the on suffix. There's also a pre-incipient aspect, meaning you're about to do something, which is how we express that concept in English, and Cherokee has the idi suffix for it. And finally, there's the momentane aspect, which is only used in Finnish, and it indicates that an action is sudden and doesn't take much time. Now so far, all the tenses and aspects we've been talking about are separate concepts that only belong within one of those categories. However, sometimes in a language, a conjugation will happen that conceptually combines a tense and an aspect. These are called conflations, and some of them have names of their own. One of these, found in the Romance languages, is called the imperfect. Not to be confused with the imperfective aspect, the imperfect, that's its whole name, is a conflation of the imperfective aspect with the past tense. It has its own name because Romance languages don't have just one way to make the past tense. There's a separate past tense with a perfective aspect, typically called the preterite, while the imperfect has a set of suffixes that indicates both the tense and aspect. Along similar lines, there's a construction in Western Europe where you indicate that something had already happened by another specified time, using the exact grammatical structure I just used to explain it, and it's called the perfect, again, not to be confused with the perfective aspect. There are multiple varieties of this. The present perfect indicates that something has happened before now. The past perfect, also known as the pluperfect, indicates that something had happened before some other past event, and the future perfect indicates that something will have happened by some point in the future. And finally, a few languages have a very interesting conflation called the discontinuous past. This means that something happened in the past, but is not still the case. So if I said, I drove to the store in the discontinuous past, this would indicate that I'm no longer at that store, whereas if I use the continuous past, I'd still be at the store. Moving on, now we'll talk about the M in TAM, the mood. Grammatical mood is a verb feature that indicates the likeliness of the verb, or just the speaker's feelings on if or how it'll happen. There may also be information on the clause the verb is in, which is something we'll get to. The most basic mood is the indicative mood, which is just the mood you use when you're saying what's going on. You're indicating it. It's also sometimes called the realis mood, referring to how it's the real-life situation, but this is mostly used to contrast it with the large category called irrealis mood, which covers a bunch of moods that don't reflect reality. One of them that you've probably heard of before is the imperative mood, which is when you're giving a command to someone. Due to the nature of this mood, it often only has conjugations for second person, but not always. For one, in languages where there's an honorific that takes third person conjugations, the imperative will have a third person form to account for this. But also, some languages like Irish just straight up have conjugations for all people in the imperative, and we translate the non-second person forms as let blank do the thing. In other languages, though, even just having a first-person plural imperative, meaning let's do the thing, is pretty common. Speaking of which, in languages where the let's form doesn't match the imperative, it takes a different name, the hortative mood, which means the speaker is encouraging something. Telugu has it, the suffix is dam. And there's another variety of this. It's used for more direct commands than the hortative, but only when not using second person. This is called the jussive mood, and Amharic has it in these forms. As you can see, there's no second person. So now let's move into some some other irrealis moods. One you've probably heard of is the conditional mood, which says that the verb would happen under certain conditions. You probably just caught it. We use the auxiliary verb would for that in English. In some languages where their equivalent for if is a verbal affix, they may call that whole if-then sequence conditional, but otherwise just the would part would take the label. Another mood that some languages have is the potential mood, which basically means can or may. Telugu has it in the form of a gala suffix, while Cherokee adds a ga prefix to the beginning of the verb. The other languages I've studied just use a verb for this purpose though. Similarly, there's a presumptive mood, which is exactly what it sounds like. You're making a presumption, an educated guess. It roughly translates to might, and Romanian has a whole set of auxiliary verbs beginning with o for it. There's also a mood for when you wish something happens, and that's called the optative mood. Staying in Romanian, their conditional mood technically has the full name of optative conditional because it does both of those roles. The optative has a certain micro-celebrity status in linguistics as one of the features that PIE had but rarely survived into the modern languages. This is because it merged with our final irrealis mood, the subjunctive mood. The subjunctive is used for verbs whose occurrence you're unsure of, not necessarily in a hopeful way like the optative, but only in subordinate clauses after the conjunction that, hence subjunctive. It's one of the most famous moods since it exists in all Romance languages and a few more conservative Germanic languages, among others. Now, the reason I made the subjunctive the last irrealis mood I explained is to introduce the next category of moods. Some languages, especially SOV languages from my experience, always conjugate the verb differently if it's in a subordinate clause regardless of the certainty of that verb. This isn't even technically a mood, but it sort of fits the vibe, so I'll include the subordinate verbs here. In Telugu, for example, any verb in the subordinate clause will replace the final vowel with ani, while in Amharic, non-past verbs remove the alle part of the suffix. And finally, something else that's generally not considered a mood, the infinitive, which refers to the verb without any conjugations on it, normally. It may still be called a mood if there's more than one form though, like in classical Latin, where different tenses and voices have different infinitives, and Portuguese, which has forms of the infinitive conjugated for people known as personal infinitives. And finally, I'll talk about a few other concepts that I haven't gotten to mention yet. First is negativity, when you say that something's not happening instead of that it is. While I called negativity a mood in my Telugu language overview, that only works in languages where negativity has its own conjugations. In most languages, where any conjugation can be made negative simply by adding a particle, a small word with grammatical meaning, the name for it is a polarity. Yeah, no, pretty cool sounding, right? By contrast, the regular sentences without the negative are called affirmative. But there's another dichotomy that can be called a mood in certain languages, and that's questions versus statements. In linguistic jargon, the questions are called interrogative, while the statements are called declarative. As for a category name for this, there isn't one, but I'd probably still call it a polarity if I had to be honest. And about questions, there are two types of them as well, and you probably know them from elementary school. Yes/no questions can only be answered with yes or no, while interrogative pronoun questions have an interrogative pronoun in them and take broader answers that actually have substance. These are also sometimes Anglo-centrically called WH questions by linguists. And finally, there's one last very cool verb feature in some languages. Evidentiality is an indication on the verb of how the speaker obtained the information they're telling, specifically one that's always required because a speaker of any language can tell you their source under their own will. The only language I've studied that has evidentiality is Cherokee, so I'll explain how that works. Basically, it only applies for the past tense, and a vowel in the suffix changes depending on the evidentiality. If the speaker directly saw or otherwise witnessed the event, that's experiential, and the suffix is "-i". But if the speaker heard about the event from someone else, or they're just supposing how it went down based on other evidence, that's reportative or inferential, and the suffix is "ei". There are other languages with more diverse categories as well, but they operate roughly along those lines. So that's it. Now you know the vast majority of what there is to know about verbs. If this video scared you, it's worth it to remember that no single language is going to use all of the verbal features from this video, so it's not like verbs are crazy. Some languages do try really hard though. If you're just starting to get into languages, I hope you learned a lot here. Thanks for watching, I'll see y'all next time.